Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. As we end 2025, I thought it would be fun to pull back a throwback episode with Curt Bench. Now, unfortunately, Curt passed away a few years ago from a brain aneurysm. Very sudden, very surprising, and very sad. Curt, I think, was the most beloved figure in all of Mormon history circles. I don't know anybody who didn't like him. He was funny. He got along with everybody. He was just a great guy. So anyway, I thought I would share our conversation. I picked Curt mostly because I thought he would say yes, and I knew he had something to do with Mark Hofmann. I think what floored me as I was sitting there during this interview was the fact that he actually was one of the first people to call Mark and say, "Hey, Mark, there's a bomber out there. You need to be careful." So that was really interesting, and we're going to talk about the Mark Hofmann bombings in this episode. So this is from the 2017 interview, and you won't want to miss it. Check it out. Would like to welcome everybody out to Gospel Tangents Podcast. I'm here with Curt Bench. He's the owner of Benchmark Books here in Salt Lake City. And Curt, first of all, I'd just like to thank you for taking some time to talk with me today.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.
All right. So Curt has a wonderful bookstore. I've bought way too many books. I've paid Curt a lot of money already. So
well, we'll decide whether you've bought too many or not.
So anyway, I know Curt was involved, was actually good friends, as I understand it, with Mark Hofmann, and kind of has a real first-hand view of things. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about your experiences, what you remember, and that sort of thing about the whole Mark Hofmann saga. So, but before I do that, do you want to give a little short commercial for your bookstore here and how you got started?
Of course, you don't have to twist my arm to do that. Well, this is our 30th year as Benchmark Books, and before that I was with Deseret Book Company, and that's where I got to know Mark Hofmann. I headed up the fine and rare books department, but another part of my life. But we've been at this location, which is I don't know how specific you want me to be, 3269 South Main Street in Salt Lake. We've been here since 1994. Prior to that, we had a little store down on Rio Grande Street, down by the Utah Historical Society. And we moved here in 1994 and have been going, strong ever since. There's always ups and downs in the business, but we specialize in LDS books, in print, out of print, used, rare, the whole gamut. We find out-of-print books for people. We have lots of new books, lots of in-print books. We specialize in Mormon studies, so you're likely to find some of the more serious history and biography and theology. We don't stock every LDS book that comes out. That's not our mission, but we've been doing this a long time, and we've had some wonderful things come through our hands, some really rare things in addition to the whatever books that you and others like to buy that aren't necessarily collectible, but just for good reading and for research. Have a small staff of 4 of us all together, but everybody knows their stuff and they like doing what they do, and we love our job here and helping people find books that they're looking for that will give them some kind of fulfillment, whether it's for research or for pleasure.
Well, I think it was the last Mormon History Association meetings, I promised myself I wasn't going to buy any books, and then I walked by your table and I bought like 3 books. So
well, so you shouldn't have that attitude to begin with about
spending
not wanting
too much
to buy
money.
books.
I don't even read all the books that I have, but it is nice to have them. So one of the books that I did buy was the Turley book and I've just actually been reading through that to kind of brush up for this as well. So
it's an important book on the subject.
Yeah. So what are some of the best books on the Hoffman case?
The first one that most people turn to is Salamander, the story of the Mormon forgery murders by Linda Silito and Alan Roberts. And then Rick Turley's Victims is offers some insights, kind of an insider's view that they weren't able to because Rick was employed by the church and had full access to general authorities and others who were involved, and was able to get a lot of important material. And he interviewed lots of people. And so, as we talked about earlier, I think if you read those two books, you'll get a really good overview of what happened. In fact, more detail than you'd probably remember. But they're both balanced and filled with important information, relevant information. Another good one is A Gathering of Saints, sorry about that, by Robert Lindsay. As an outsider, I think he did a very respectable job. He was kind of on the scene fairly early when it came to books, and he's the one that did The Falcon and the Snowman, which was a national bestseller but made into a movie. I think he did a decent job, and there were lots of other books that mention Hoffman, and there's some that weren't very good. There have been lots of documentaries and lots of articles and other things that have been done on the subject. You know, this year will be 32 years since the bombings, and so, but the interest is still quite high, I think, for something that happened that long ago.
Well, you know, murder is a kind of an interesting subject, especially when it comes to religion, I think.
That's true, and we'd never had anything like that happen in Utah or in, you know, Mormon history per se. Certainly there's been violence from time to time, but it was such an unusual, horrendous, dramatic kind of story. It is intriguing, but very sad and tragic.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about, you know, kind of the beginnings. I mean, how you actually knew Mark Hofmann. How did you get introduced to him?
Well, I tell people I didn't know him as well as I wish I had, you know, as I should have. And when you said we were good friends, we were friends, but we did a lot of business together. He had kind of established himself as I guess today what would we say, kind of a rock star. I mean, he had made some amazing discoveries of Mormon documents, the Anton transcript and, you know, things like that got him a lot of attention. And I met him, and I was in the same business, although we hadn't really done documents very much, maybe once in a while, but we did a lot of rare books and other collectibles. And so I was kind of excited to meet Mark Hofmann, who had gotten all this attention and had established himself as an expert in documents, and as well as other things, rare books and things. So it made sense for me to get to know him and to do business with him, and we did a lot of business over the next few years.
What approximately, do you remember what year it was?
About 1980 or 81, somewhere in there. And then...
So by that time he had already established a name for himself.
Yes.
as finding a lot of rare books and coins and things.
Yeah, by the time that I met him, he had already made some discoveries that got him a lot of media attention, and so he came into my store. I was managing one of the Deseret bookstores, and he came in and introduced himself, and I hate to say it, but the rest is history.
Well, great. What were some of the things did you purchase things from him?
Oh, we purchased lots of things from him. And not all Mormon stuff, too. I mean, he presented us with things that were fascinating, but most of it was Utah or Mormon related. But I mean, sometimes we would take things on consignment. I remember we had a Martha Washington document. Some of the things, I mean, I could recall some of the things that came through our hands. There was a promissory note that was signed by Orrin Porter Rockwell, with his ex. Elijah Abel, the black who held the priesthood, a document that had his ex. Mark was good at doing X's, apparently. And we had a Daniel Boone document. I'm just trying to think of some things that weren't just in the Mormon field. And some things were books, but quite often they were documents. And so this was my big foray into that field. I was a relative novice when it came to Mormon manuscripts and documents. And so I kind of let him guide me in a lot of cases. And when he wasn't dramatic at all and didn't really seem like he was trying to sell you. You know, he wasn't a used car salesman type at all. He was quiet and introspective, but he never made a big deal about things. But often he would say, "It's a nice item," you know. But he would tell you the background and why he thought it was saleable, and it would always give you a good enough deal that you didn't feel you could pass it up. And if anything ever went wrong, he would take it back. I mean, one time, I don't remember when it was, but we had a signed Brigham Young photograph, and I sold it to a man who was very knowledgeable about such things, and he took a look at it and examined it closely and returned it because he said it's a forgery. That's not Brigham Young's signature. I can't remember all the details now, but he determined that it couldn't be good because of the paper and so on. And so I told Mark, and he said, "Oh, no problem. I'll talk to the guy I got it from, you know, and I'll try to get my money back."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he did that a lot. So if there was ever a question about something, he would take it back, and then he would always, you know, well, I'll talk to, you know, my source about that. And
Okay, so there were cases where, I mean, because it sounds like he wasn't really unmasked until the bombing, but there were cases
after that,
before
it wasn't
that.
at the bombing. It was considerably after that he was really unmasked.
Oh, okay.
It took a while.
But even before, there were cases where people would say, "This looks like a forgery, I don't believe this," and so they'd get their money back or whatever.
Occasionally.
Okay, so it wasn't a frequent thing, but there were.
It happened. And another example that I can think of is William Clayton's Latter-day Saints Emigrant's Guide, which is a printed item. And we got one from him and showed it to, or either showed it to or described it to an expert who'd been doing this kind of thing for a long time. And he determined by the way it was laid out and it was gathered, printed things are done in signatures, groupings of pages, and it had the wrong grouping. And anyway, he determined that was probably a later, it might not have been a deliberate forgery, but it was somebody had done it later and hadn't done it according to the way the original was done. And so I told Mark that, and it was the same kind of thing. Well, okay, I'll take it back and give you your money back, or I can't remember if he traded us something else, but he made good on it, and said that, you know, he was upset to find out that it wasn't real. And of course, later we found out that he had done more than one. He actually printed those himself.
Oh, wow.
And we found out much later. And a friend of mine who was a collector had also gotten one. And so one thing that maybe we might be leading to this at some point, but Mark was really good at compartmentalizing, I think himself, but also people. And to one group, he would appear sympathetic, whether, you know, and we didn't know any of this. But when he was with, you know, anti-Mormons, they probably thought he was one of them. Liberal Mormons, historians, you know, different groups, and those who were also doing business with him. But he was able to. There was never an occasion where all those people could get together and compare notes, and so you know, we were kind of in our own isolated groups, and so we didn't know what he was up to for a long time because he was so good at masking that and hiding things from people and kind of blending in and making you feel like he was one of you, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, so he basically told people what they wanted to hear.
Yeah, he did a lot of that. And in fact, you know, a lot of things in retrospect seem clear. You know, as they say, hindsight is always 20/20, but we didn't have that benefit of hindsight then. But he would almost do a special order for you. I mean, you could talk to Brent Ashworth and find out that, you know, one very dramatic example was that Brent said, wouldn't it be great to have something written by Joseph Smith from the Carthage jail? Well, Mark came up with such a thing, and I was involved with that at one point too, but you know, sometimes you would let him know what you really wanted, and eventually something like that might come about.
Wow, that's interesting.
Special orders.
That's funny. People who may not be familiar with the Salamander Letter, you know, why is it called that? What was in it, and that sort of thing.
Well, the thing that was such a big deal about the Salamander Letter, or White Salamander Letter, was that it was in the hand of Martin Harris, and that just, there wasn't anything previously known, and it gave a much different story about the plates and what happened at the Hill Cumorah. It was such a dramatic departure from the traditional story because Joseph is there to get the plates in the hill, and there's a white salamander in the hole, and it's transformed into a spirit, and it's just it had all these magical folk magic kinds of connections and so on that nobody had ever heard before. It was just such a, I mean, it was as different a story or a different take on the traditional story as one could imagine. And so he had claimed to have gotten it back east as a letter that came into his hands through a compatriot of his, when actually later we find out that Mark created the document. But it kind of turned Mormon history on its head, and then you have people squaring up on each side, scholars that are trying to make sense of it, and others just saying that there's no way that could be true, and Steve was paying researchers, I mean, this is over a period of time, obviously, to look into it, and we had some genuine scholars looking at why this all made sense and putting it into the historical context of folk magic and the Smith family's belief in folk magic and those kinds of things that nobody had, well, I shouldn't say nobody, people had looked into. The Tanners, I mean, early anti-Mormon works had a lot of these kinds of things that Mark built on. I mean, he knew his stuff, he knew his history, and so he didn't just create documents out of whole cloth, so to speak. Usually use paper. But you know, he had background, and it made sense if you knew your history. So there was a big debate about whether this was real. Of course, it was tested, and Steve was the one that bought it and to give to the church. And as I recall, it was $40,000, which was a lot of money back then in the 80s. Still is. Still is. But that was the one that really got the most attention, and just, I mean, that had.
So had that been authenticated at the time of the bombing?
There was no, at the time of the bombing, I don't think there was any doubt about its
So
authenticity.
everybody believed it was authentic.
Well, not everybody, but those who worked with it and tested it and so on did. But there were people, especially that are looking at it from afar, that it just never made any sense to them at all.
And I think the Tanners,
Right.
they're known as anti-Mormon, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, were one of the skeptics, which, I mean, that seems kind of strange, doesn't it?
They were skeptical. I don't think they certainly didn't think that it was a modern forgery, or that Mark Hofmann had anything to do with it until later. But yeah, they were skeptical. They were among the earliest skeptics.
What were their reasons for skepticism?
Yeah, they were looking at it in historical context, and I think just content wise. But I can't remember exactly if you were to take the top three arguments against, but I think they felt that it was probably an early forgery.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
And I don't think they ever laid it at his doorstep.
At Hoffman's doorstep.
Until later.
Okay, so they thought it might have been an early forgery.
I think so, if I remember right.
Okay, that's interesting. That's cool. Yeah. What are some other documents that Hoffman forged that you're familiar with?
Well, one is, as I was telling you a little bit about earlier, the letter from Carthage jail. It was a letter from Joseph Smith to Jonathan Dunham, who was the head of the Nauvoo Legion, calling upon him to come and rescue them, basically. And so that would have probably been the last thing that Joseph ever wrote.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that was big.
I think, and that has actually been used, I believe Quinn used that in one of his books, Extensions of Power, Origins of Power, I can't remember.
He may have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mean as a
source?
As if
yeah.
it were.
I remember reading that in one of Quinn's books and being like, "Oh, I didn't know that was a Hoffman forgery."
Well, in Dean Jesse's personal writings of Joseph Smith, there were either 6 or 8 items that were in there that were forgeries that they had to do an errata for, and then take it out in later edition. But there were several books that had references to Hoffman forgeries that had to change those later.
Wow.
But the Dunham letter, and it's part of a complicated story. I don't know that you want to get into the whole thing here, but he had promised it to Brent Ashworth a long time before for a lot less money. Brent was the one that said, wouldn't it be great to have such a letter? And yet Mark sold it to another collector. But in order to get back in Brent's good graces, Mark had us, and I say us meaning Deseret Book, buy it back from this collector so that he could make it available to Brent for a lot less money. So he actually took a big loss on it.
Oh, wow.
To offer it once again to Brent. We don't have the time to really flesh that all out, but it was bizarre, as I found out later. But the numbers were incredible. So the price was $100,000
for the Dunham letter.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's in the 80s. So that was I'm sure that was the most money ever put on any Mormon document at the time.
Wow. I was reading the victim's book. I know another big document was the patriarchal blessing of Joseph Smith III. Can you tell us what you know about that?
Yeah, because that also impacted me in an indirect way. There had always been stories and some documentation of Joseph Smith having, a variety of methods of succession for him. I don't think he ever really thought he was going to go when he was young, be taken. So he explored lots of ideas for his succession. But one of them was his son, Joseph III. And so Mark created this document, which was done in Thomas Bullock's hand. And boy, you see it, and it looks just like Thomas Bullock's hand.
Wow.
He was amazing. I mean, his versatility was amazing. Men, women, different ages. It's just unbelievable how many different signatures and how many different hands he could do. But it basically confirmed the reorganized church's story of how Joseph III had been blessed and was supposed to be the successor to his father, and so they wanted to get that, and Mark started to negotiate with them, but ended up selling it or trading. I think could have been cash and trade, I don't remember, to our church, to the LDS church. And so that made them upset. And anyway, there was negotiating back and forth because, it made more sense to have that in the hands of the reorganized church. And so there was a trade for a Book of Commandments, which is the 1833 compilation of Joseph Smith's revelations that was never finished because, as you remember, the press and the pages and so on were destroyed by the mob in Independence in July of 1833. So a very rare book. Well, at the time, the Book of Mormon, first edition, 1830, was probably selling for about $5,000. And somebody speculated that a Book of Commandments would be worth $20,000. And so the church got a Book of Commandments in exchange for the blessing. And so one day somebody called me up at Deseret Book and said, that book they've been talking about, the Book of Commandments? Well, I have one. I'll bet you do. I mean, I'd heard that story before. And anyway, to make a long story short, brought in the book. It was a real Book of Commandments.
This is from Mark Hofmann or something?
Well, no, this kind of brought it out from this. I mean, this guy knew from hearing on the news about this Book of Commandments that the church had gotten and the value of $20,000. He knew he had this old book in his house in this desk drawer, and sure enough, it was that book. So that's when he called me and brought it down, and it was a genuine Book of Commandments. And so we've negotiated, and I agreed to buy the book for $16,000, which is 3 times the price of a Book of Mormon.
Wow.
But sold it immediately, made a good profit, and my superiors were happy. But that came about because of, in a manner of speaking, because of the Joseph Smith III blessing.
Wow. So this was just somebody in Salt Lake that had a Book of Commandments lying around. Wow.
He and his family had inherited.
So how do you authenticate something like that? How did you know it was real?
Well, I'd seen a lot of old books, and certainly had several of the first edition of the Book of Mormon. And I can't remember if I don't think I'd actually seen one before, unless I'd seen it over at the church library. But it met all the tests. You could just tell from the binding, from the age of the paper and the look and so on. And then, and then the guy that I sold it to had seen several and held them and had actually been involved in the sale of them before. And so there's no doubt about it whatsoever. And I've seen several since.
Wow.
But
so if I bring
that was exciting. Yeah, what?
If I bring an old book, you can authenticate it?
Probably, yeah. I mean, that is a question about authentication that I get asked a lot when it comes to documents, especially because documents are unique. Books are not. I mean, they're printed and bound at the same time usually, and it can meet the sight and the smell tests and so on. But documents, that's a lot harder thing, and people wonder about how Mark was able to create these documents and have nobody catch him at it? Well, he knew what he was doing. He used the right ink from old recipes and the right paper that he stole from libraries, period paper. He did his homework, so to speak.
Well, and that's one of the things in that victim's book. One of the things that I noticed was Mark would trade legitimate or forged documents for legitimate documents, which
Right.
kind of, I'm sure, muddied all those waters as well.
Right.
And in one case, I remember, I have to wonder, what did the church officials think when he made the request that he would like some blank pages from the first edition Book of Mormon? And I guess the reason why was because then it would be from the period paper, so it would be actual period paper. So if you did I don't know if it's a carbon date test or whatever, it would match the time period,
Right.
and then he would
Right.
write on it.
Right. He stole paper out of old books from several local libraries to do that very thing. And then he used the formula for the ink. He actually got it from a book about forgery.
Oh, really?
Yeah, by a famous book dealer. And
So he would make his own inks.
he made his own ink. And the problem was he had to make it look old. Obviously it was freshly applied. And so he used a variety of substances, and eventually that tripped him up because in this artificial aging process, it created a cracking effect in the ink that under ultraviolet light was visible and under a microscope. And so they were able to determine, later on which ones were forgeries and which ones weren't in the church holdings and elsewhere. But he was able to fool a number of experts that did tests on some of his documents, and they were not able to detect that they were forgeries, or it was unclear. Like his Oath of a Freeman, which was the first printed item in America that he tried to sell to the Library of Congress for $1 million to $1.5 million.
Wow.
He completely created that. He had the plates made for it. He printed it and altered letters and kind of rubbed them down so they looked old, and he did all kinds of things. And the Library of Congress was doing tests on it, and the American Antiquarian Society was another that looked very closely at buying that. And that was a huge deal when that failed to sell, because Mark owed so many people money because of his schemes, and a lot of it was over the McClellan collection, which nobody ever saw, but there was a lot of talk about and a lot of money that changed hands over it. And because that failed to sell, the Oath of a Freeman, Mark was in a world of hurt financially and had to come up with money.
Because the Library of Congress document.
Yeah, they did not buy it, and neither did the American Antiquarian Society.
Is that because they thought it was a forgery? Or
No, they never determined that it was forgery.
So they thought
part of it was price, I think, and they weren't positive that it was good. I mean, nobody had ever seen one before.
Oh.
It had never. They knew what the text was, but nobody knew what it looked like. So Mark was able to create it, and he also he planted it at Argosy Bookstore in New York, and had several things put on a receipt that he bought that day, and that was one, so that he could establish that he had bought it from a reputable bookstore in New York City.
Wow. And
I remember him telling me about that, showed me the invoice, and there it was, Oath of a Freeman, $25 as I recall.
He brought it into the bookstore and then bought it.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow.
Along with some other things, kind of threw it in the mix and said he had found it up with the pamphlets. They had an entire room that was just, early pamphlets and books and things like that, and they didn't inventory everything, so as far as they knew, it was one of their items.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite a schemer he was.
Oh, he was.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the other people. Who are the other, either high-profile people or even the people that I believe you knew Steve Christensen. He was one of
Yes.
the people that was killed.
Yes.
Let's talk about Steve. Tell us a little bit about him.
Steve, I was doing business with him when I was at the downtown Deseret Book. That's where I started doing the used and rare books full time. Before that, I had managed a couple of Deseret Books branch stores and had done that as a sideline, used and out of print and so on. And then it just grew so big that I started doing it full time at the downtown store. We were actually a store within a store, and I managed that. And so that's when I got to know Steve, as I recall. I don't think I knew him before then, but he just had this insatiable hunger for books and for Mormon history, and he had incredible files. He had entire filing cabinets full of research material that he had gathered, and he read voraciously. He was a really good guy, sense of humor. He was just a real personable guy, very knowledgeable. He knew what he wanted. And he bought a lot of books from me. And eventually, when things went south for him financially, CFS, where he worked, and that figures into the whole
CFS?
story. Coordinated Financial Services, as I recall the name of it.
And what did he do there?
And he was one of the executives there. He was partners with Gary Sheets, who also figures into the story, because it was Gary Sheets' wife who was also killed by a bomb set by Hoffman.
Now, is this like a stock market?
It was a financial company. They did investments and so on, and they eventually went bankrupt. But Steve left before that all happened, went on his own, and that's when he had his office in the Judge Building downtown Salt Lake. But I talked to Steve many times, went to his office, helped him get books, but eventually, as I was saying earlier, he had financial difficulties because of his connection there with CFS and getting started on his own and so on. And so he felt like he needed to liquidate his library, and so I actually helped him sell a lot of his personal library before things
with his financial business.
Yeah, and so I would consider Steve a friend, although we didn't ever become close friends where we talked all the time, but he was a very good customer, and I respected him greatly and really liked him, and we had frequent conversations, and he was just very open about everything, would let you borrow whatever you wanted, as far as research material, or he was a very generous person. He gave away lots of books.
Now, is he related? I know there's a big Utah clothing store, Mr. Mack, and I think Mac Christensen. Is he related to him?
Yeah, Mac is his father.
Okay.
Yeah, Steve worked for his dad for a long time, and then left that business, the clothing business, and went into financial services.
And I believe Mac does something with the Tabernacle Choir, or he used to.
Mac was president of the choir for a while.
Okay.
For several years.
And I know a lot of people, especially if you're from Utah, have seen Mac's, Mr. Mac.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can't miss them.
I bought my suits from Mr. Mac.
Right. He's a great guy. He was a very generous man and has been a good friend as well.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Kathy Sheets.
Yeah. I did never know her. It was only later after she was the second victim on that fateful October 15th, 1985. And so I didn't ever have the pleasure of meeting her, but I've only heard really good things about her, a wonderful human being. But she figured into the whole Hoffman scheme, and as you know, it's a very long, complicated story, and it's difficult to get to the heart of it, but she was just a victim of his machinations as he's trying to buy time and to throw the authorities and whoever off the scent so to speak. It was a diversion, and which makes it all the more cold-blooded. But Steve was his first victim, and that was that morning, and then she was early afternoon. And then, well, you know, I don't know how much background you want, but I mean, that day, I talked to Mark on the phone the day of the bombings.
Oh, really?
Several times, probably 6 or 7 times. And I called first to warn him about the bombings, bombing at that point, because, you know, there was a lot on the news. I was actually driving to work that morning, and they said there was a bomb that had gone off in the Judge building. It was just a few blocks from where I worked. And they even, as I recall, gave the office number and said a young businessman had been killed. Well, I only knew one person in the Judge building, and that was Steve Christensen. So as soon as I got to my office at work, I looked up in my directory under his name, and there was that office number in the Judge building, and I was just sick. Physically, I mean, it was just, it was horrible. And so I felt that I needed to confirm. They didn't give a name on the news, so just so happened that Matt Christensen's store, the main store, was in the ZCMI Center where Deseret Book also was, and I would see him and say hello down there. And so I ran down to his store, and he was talking to 2 men. I don't know who they were, but there were tears streaming down his face. So that
Matt
was
Christensen's
Max.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I knew that it was Steve.
Hmm.
So I went back and called Mark Hofmann's phone, and one thing about him is you could never just reach him on the phone. You either had to leave a message on the machine or talk to his wife. He would always call you back. You could never just call him. And so I got the answering machine, and I said, Mark, this is Curt. This is an emergency. Call me back immediately as soon as you get this. And a short time later, he called and just kind of lightheartedly said, Curt, this is Mark. You said it was an emergency, but then everything's an emergency with you. Just making a joke. And then I told him what had happened, and that Steve Christensen had been killed, and there was a sharp intake of breath, and what? Like he was genuinely shocked. And I told him everything I'd heard, and he just, it was as if he had never heard a thing. And I warned him, told him to get his family out of the house, to go, get into hiding, whatever, because we didn't know what was going on. And
so because I know originally it seems like, because Steve was a financial thing, there was a lot of people that thought, well, this must be something to do with his finances. But you originally thought this has something to do with...
Well, I didn't know.
Oh, okay.
Nobody knew. And that very day there was speculation about, did it have something to do with Mormon documents? Because, Steve had been in the news with... I'm trying to remember about the news part, but certainly it was known that he had been involved in trying to get the Salamander Letter. And so...
so you made the connection that you thought it could have been?
Well, it could have been, yeah. But there was speculation early on about, was this business related? Because there were angry investors with the Sheets Company, CFS, and then after the let me get back real quick. So I told Mark, let's stay in touch. So then when there was a second bombing, and it was Kathy Sheets, who was married to Gary Sheets of CFS, Steve's old boss or partner. I can't remember if, I think they were partners, but so then it seemed like it must be business related. And there was there was all kinds of speculation. Even later we found out, some wondered if it was the mafia or, just angry investors or, what the heck was going on. Nobody knew. And so, so I talked to him several times that day. And as I look back, I could see, I mean, by the questions he asked me, he wondered about how this was playing out in the media and with what people were saying, and well, what are they saying, and is this so? After the second bombing, I remember him saying something about, well, it must be business related, and I said, well, not necessarily. It could be Mormon documents. Gary Sheets had some involvement or knowledge of the Salamander Letter, and there were some connections there. And so I said, who knows? I said, you need to get your family out. And he goes, okay, I will. But yeah, we talked several times that day, and in retrospect, I can see how I was kind of a sounding board to see how his scheme was working.
Did he answer his phone that day?
No, he always called me back. Yeah, I don't think it's possible. Yeah, although he did have a car phone. I think
really?
Back then, yeah, I think so.
It was a little big brick, right?
I don't know how those worked. No, it's possible I could have gotten him once that day because that was a real dramatic thing. But generally speaking, you couldn't just call him up and get him. In fact, a lot of times I had to go over to his house. He lived a mile or mile and a half from me, and in fact, one of the big ways that I was involved with Steve and him is Steve needed me to convey some information to Mark, and so I literally went over to his house and talked to him, which I had to do frequently because it was too frustrating to try to get him on the phone. Sometimes it was just easier to go see him.
Oh, wow.
And, we did things socially there. We had dinner with him and his wife a number of times. Even had hot tub parties, which we didn't go to those. But yeah, we considered the Hoffmans friends and did things socially as well as a lot of business. So remember I told you about the warning, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next day, which is the 16th of October, I'm driving. Actually, I had been somewhere to try to negotiate a deal that was based on information I had gotten from him. So I'm driving back to my office, and on the news it said there was a third bomb. And keep in mind, this is surreal for our area. I mean, these bombings are going on. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows why. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty, and then when there's a third bomb, and then I find out that it's Mark Hofmann, that's the victim, I about drove off the road. And I remember hitting my steering wheel and saying aloud to myself, Mark, why didn't you listen to me? He didn't seek safety, and he was the third victim. And then they started on the news, they were speculating that he might be a suspect, which was a whole new twist. And so at that point, and there's lots of phone calls, and a lot of us are talking to each other, speculating, and what have you heard, and comparing notes and so on. But then when they're looking at him as a suspect rather than just a victim, more than one of us, there were a few of us who decided that we better go tell the Salt Lake police what we knew, just because we don't know what's going on, but we do know some things that might be helpful. So Shannon Flynn, who was involved in a number of ways, he and I were down there at the same time, as was Wade Lillywhite, who has more in the story later. But we were interviewed by the detectives, and I remember reviewing with them all these events, and at the time I was keeping a journal, and I wrote all this down, and I wrote a lot of things down that later made a lot of sense, but I couldn't believe at the time, well, if he were the guilty party, then he would have done this for this reason and so on, and I was sort of making connections without really believing them. And yeah, it was a little frightening later to reread everything I'd written and have all the things that I thought couldn't be true be true. And so anyway, I was sharing a lot of information with the detective, and he kept referring to him as the guy that did it, the perpetrator, we know he's the one. No, he couldn't be. But then I found myself saying, but if he were, then, this makes sense. And turned out that was right, but I couldn't believe it at the time.
You were right,
I just couldn't believe it at the time. And so it was quite a while later that I and others could bring ourselves to believe that Mark was guilty of anything. And of course there was nothing known about forgeries at the time. This was all bombings and possible connection to document dealing. And I think you asked me if we were scared or if there was fear. What, I can't remember.
Yeah, were you fearful for your own?
So yeah, I never felt like I was in imminent danger, although I knew it was a possibility. None of us knew, and there were lots of people that were kind of heading for the hills. So after I went to the police, then we all knew that there was a very real threat to further loss of life. And so I remember leaving the police station with Shannon Flynn. He says he had asked me if I wanted to go.
Who is Shannon?
Shannon was another friend of Mark's, did a lot of business with him. He got charged with, he helped Mark make an Uzi submachine gun into fully automatic. Anyway, but he'd done a lot. He was a friend and business associate of Mark, so there were several of those. Anyway, that didn't stick, and but he was, telling the police what he knew that was relevant and so on, and
so you said that didn't stick. What didn't stick?
Well, the charge for they dropped that.
Because basically the charge was that he was
he was helping him make an illegal weapon, basically. And so anyway, we were leaving the same time. They asked if I wanted to go see Mark's car, which was over by the Deseret Gym, near the church office building that had been blown up. The car, not the Deseret Gym.
Which is now the conference center, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I said, yeah, I would. And so we went out to his car, and we kind of looked at each other, and
you and Shannon.
Yes. And he opens his hood and looks under the hood. We look under the car for bombs. That's how paranoid we were. So yeah, there was fear, or at least knowing that it was a possibility. But yeah, there was a feeling of paranoia in the air for sure. And so then we drove over and looked at Mark's car, and as I recall, I can't remember, this may be in my imagination, but it seems like there were still little wisps of smoke and steam, it had burned up and they put it out. So
this was the same day?
But it was the blackened hulk of a car. Same day, this was on the 16th.
Now, was this a pipe bomb or was it something else?
Pipe bomb.
It was bomb.
But it was not packed with shrapnel like the others were.
Oh.
So it was an explosive device without shrapnel. That's how he survived.
Oh,
so
that's why the other two died.
So there's speculation as to whether it was what it was meant to do.
I've heard that people think that it was an accident that he blew up himself.
Well, I think
I've also heard that people thought that he did it to throw everybody off the case.
Right, you do.
What do you think?
It's possible that it was meant for Brent Ashworth. They used to meet together at the Crossroads Mall on, I think that was a Wednesday, if I remember right. I'm not positive on that, but they used to meet, and so there is speculation that he could have gotten Brent out of the way, who had become a real irritant and had just been fed up with Mark's shenanigans. They had lots of conflicts, and it wasn't like he suspected forgery or anything, but there have been so many botched deals and things that didn't come through the way they're supposed to, And Mark could be difficult to deal with financially, especially. He would bounce checks, and I mean, he did that to me a couple of times. But he would, he'd always make good, and you just put up with certain things. He had some idiosyncrasies that were a little strange.
It seems strange that he would bounce checks when he's making $40,000 on a document or whatever.
Yeah, it does.
I mean,
but
did he
it
have
a number
another
of
job
times.
besides this document?
No, that became his full-time job. But anyway, let me just get back to your earlier thing about the fear and so on. So shortly after, that night, I talked to the police, and someone suggested that I have we lived in the county, and someone suggested that we have county sheriffs go out to my house and look for bombs. And so I sent my family to my mother-in-law's place, and so that our house would be vacant. And so I was there with 2 sheriff's deputies, and we were going through my house room by room, in the garage and the yard. And there was actually kind of a lighter moment when I'm leading the way, pushing doors open gingerly. There was something in black plastic by my front door that I didn't remember what it was, and we're all looking at it like, what's that? And I'm thinking, I don't know. And it was big and wrapped in black plastic. So I called my wife, and she reminded me that a neighbor had brought it over for me to look at. So it was some old thing they wanted. So anyway, I'm pushing doors open, and we're walking through and shining lights, and these guys are ready for action. And I remember saying, "Hey, I don't get paid to do this. You do this." So I made one of them get in front of me and going through room to room. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, that was genuine. I guess you could say that was genuine fear, or at least the possibilities of what could happen. Particularly, I was worried about my family.
Especially in light of Kathy Sheets.
Exactly.
She was an unintended victim,
exactly. Although we didn't know why she died at the time. And another, I don't know, this is kind of an aside here, but another...
The gospel tangents, we can go on.
Okay, tangent's good. Brent Ashworth and his wife left their home to get away because they knew that he was a possible target. With all this wondering about who the targets really were, and if it was something to do with Mormon documents, then he could be a possible victim, target. So they left, and they left their family with, I don't remember with whom, but his son, who was out riding his bike on a Sunday when they were gone, when they were basically in hiding, I guess. And he was hit by a car or a truck, and it was his son, his young son, and was in a coma for a long time and passed away. And so for Brent, those things are intertwined. So Mark and the death of his son, and not to mention all the other damage that he had done financially, emotionally. And yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that in Brent Ashworth's life, the Mark and all the things that he did, the damage that he caused, also included the death of his son, because that wouldn't have happened had Brent and his wife been home and been supervising the kids, and he wouldn't have been out riding his bike, and that accident wouldn't have occurred. But you were asking about other things that happened that kind of showed the fear that was present. I remember coming home one day, and there was a box in my mailbox on my on the side of my house there, and I didn't want to touch it. This was shortly after the bombings, and so I actually had to go down and track down the mailman to see if he had just delivered that, and he had, and just turned out to be some books that I'd ordered or something. But the thought occurred to me, could be a bomb.
There was no return address on there or anything?
Yeah, I couldn't see it close enough because I didn't want to touch it. So I could just see this box.
Now, as I recall, there was a package delivered to the Sheets family, and that it was Kathy that picked it up, and that's when it blew up.
That's right.
And so, did you know that when you saw this package you didn't recognize?
Well, the same thing occurred to me that it could happen. So I knew that was a possibility. But I knew that if the mailman had been throwing it around in his truck, that it was pretty safe. But yeah, and the really tragic and the cold-blooded aspect especially of Kathy's death that day was that later Mark said that it wouldn't have mattered whether she had picked it up or somebody else had picked it up or nobody picked it up, but they saw Gary Sheets' name on it, and then they knew it was a bomb. I mean, the fact that it killed somebody wasn't even necessarily a factor, or it could have been a neighborhood child, or he just wanted to send a message. So that's how cold that was. And then obviously the murder of Steve Christensen was extremely cold-blooded, and had Mark not been in the financial straits that he was in and had all this pressure on him, I don't think he would have killed anybody. But the fact that he could do it so easily,
that he could get away with it.
And get away with it, and on that day that he talked to me, the first day, when he's actually sort of making jokes right after he'd killed somebody, that's frightening.
That's terrible. Now, we were talking a little bit about the preliminary hearing. Do you remember anything with that?
Yes. They did. They agreed to do that rather than go to trial. But they did hear witnesses and so on. They heard from all kinds of people, including myself.
So you testified? Yes,
I did. And I was interviewed by both sides. Prosecution and the defense. And what I was going to say earlier was that it took quite a while for most of us to believe that Mark could be guilty, but after I met with the police on numerous occasions and the prosecution, I mean, they presented so much evidence to me and so much information that I could no longer deny, because early on, I mean, we were going to visit Mark, see how he was doing. And,
at the hospital?
No, at his place. But he came into my store once in his wheelchair with his arm in a cast and all of that. And
so they didn't jail him right away?
No, they didn't. No, it took a long time before they had enough evidence to charge him. And then, so the preliminary hearing.
Well, let me ask you a question, okay. Because you had said that following when Mark got blown up, that you had gone to the police, and that I thought the police had said
after he was.
Yeah, after the bomb blew up, you said I thought you said that the police said, yeah, we think it's Mark, and you were like, well, no.
Yeah, right, they did, okay. Because
so they
which I didn't know at the time, but an alcohol, tobacco, and firearms expert was on the scene, and they had gotten statements from Mark as to what had happened. And he knew that the story he was telling was not true, that it couldn't have happened the way that he said it happened.
The way that Mark said it happened.
Right. So then they started looking at the evidence on the scene and putting two and two together, and law enforcement, determined that he was the bomber.
Okay.
So I still didn't believe any of that, and nobody else did either that I knew. Because that was just the beginning.
Do you know what Mark's story was that he told to them, or that couldn't have possibly?
That I think he said he was getting into his car, and there was a package in his car, and he went to pick it up, and it blew up, and blew him out into the road. I'd have to double check the details, but by the way the blast was, and how he described the situation didn't match. And so the ATF guy just, I guess, early on concluded that he wasn't telling the truth. And then he said something which could have been a confession that a nurse heard, but they got that a court order to not be able to use that because was it because he hadn't been, it was privileged information or something, and so, you know, I don't know that we ever found out what the nurse heard that day, but, you know, Mark may have been willing to talk about what had happened. I don't know, but he did end up not telling the truth to the police about what had happened. And so, yeah, they were convinced, but it took a long time to convince me and others that he was guilty. He was our friend. He was a guy we'd known and done business with for years, and your friends don't kill people, you know, and there was no talk then of forgery or you know, nobody knew about the financial schemes or, you know, him being a con man or anything like that. So that was all to come. So
So you were disbelieving the police for a period of
yeah, until finally it just became overwhelming.
Okay.
And then I'm prepared by the time we have the preliminary hearing. I've been prepped, you know, by the prosecution as to what to expect and what they're going to want to ask, and and so they asked about some. This is really gets complicated, but part of the reason that Steve was involved was that Mark had defaulted on a huge loan that had been granted. You know, this was supposedly to get the McClellan collection, which was a collection material from William McClellan that supposedly had all kinds of embarrassing material and sensitive material that, you know, was anti-Mormon, and at one point Mark, you know, he described it to me that it was 2 apple crates full of material, and it had some stuff from the Book of Abraham, and later a piece of papyrus that he had gotten from another rare book dealer, documents dealer. He said was part of the McClellan collection, which it wasn't.
Now, who was William McClellan?
He was an early LDS apostle that apostatized, and he was early a very staunch convert and important apostle who later left. And
was that with the Kirtland banking crisis that he left?
No, it was before that.
Oh, it was before that.
Well, I think I can't. You know, now that you mention it, I don't remember what year he left, but most of his life he, you know, didn't have anything to do with the Mormons.
Okay.
So Mark, with this collection, he kept getting money from people to buy it so that the church could get it, because it had this sensitive material in it, and there was talk of selling it to the church, there was talk of donating it to the church, and different people were involved, but it involved huge amounts of money that were all fraudulently obtained from good people that meant well, but it was a huge amount of money. And so Mark had defaulted on a loan from a local bank that one of its board members was a general authority. And so one of the things that happened was that Mark paid us. You remember that Dunham letter that I told you about? He owed us a huge amount of money for that, and gave me one day a check for it because I'd been pressing him for it. And then Steve Christensen calls and wants to know how Deseret Book got this huge check. And I'm thinking, wow, how would you know about that? And so he was getting pressure from above to find out what was going on, because Mark had not made good on this loan and it was causing some real problems. And so Steve was enjoined to try to get to the bottom of it, and knowing that we'd just been paid this huge amount of money, Steve came to me and said, you know, there's a real problem here. Mark stands to have some real serious things happen to him. And he says, I've been in touch with a 70 and an apostle. He never named them, but they said all these dire things could happen. His ability to deal with President Hinckley might go away. He could be sued. He could go to jail. He could lose his church membership. Not have the ability to deal with the church anymore. All these things could happen if he didn't make good. And so Steve could never get a hold of him either. So he knew I could, and that's when he came to me and said, will you go pass on this information? Which I did. To Mark. So I went to his house and told him all that, and he just didn't seem too concerned about it and said, thanks. And so that came up in the preliminary hearing with some of the things that were leading up to the bombings and the financial pressure. And
so he had owed Deseret Book a bunch of money, which he actually paid.
Right.
And the check didn't bounce?
Right.
Oh, wow.
It was a cashier's check.
It was a cashier's check. And then he also owed Steve Christensen some money in the church.
Well, he owed a lot of people money. He owed Al Rust money. He owed the bank $185,000. He owed Al Rust more than that. Al Rust, the coin dealer, who was also financing the McClellan collection.
Oh.
I mean, several people. That same con was used on several people, and this collection didn't actually exist. And so one of the, there actually was, ironically, a McClellan collection that the church had acquired after the turn of the century by Joseph F. Smith. There was McClellan material, but nobody knew about it. Excuse me. Mark had a number of things in the trunk of his car the day the bomb went off, documents and papers and other things, and so there is speculation that he wanted that to happen, although maybe he was even willing to get injured. But if his car blew up and it burned up, then he could say that the McClellan collection was in the trunk, because there were a number of things rescued from there, just a conglomeration of all kinds of stuff that, had it burned up completely, might have fooled people. So that is one of the speculations there. So anyway, that scenario was explored in the preliminary hearing in my testimony. Another thing that was interesting was it was unfortunate, but it worked out really well for Mark, that Deseret Book had acquired some materials from descendants of the Harris family that had these things. They had a first edition Book of Mormon, and they had a Book of Common Prayer from about 1830, I think, in their possession, and they sold them to Deseret Book, and Deseret Book had them for a long time, and we knew the provenance, or the background, the genealogy of those materials, and so it came from the Harris family. So Nathan Harris, which I think Martin's brother, was known to have come from this family. So I showed Mark this Book of Common Prayer, which was no big deal, but he said, well, I'll give you $50 for it. And I don't have a customer, I might as well. And later he said, there was some writing in the back of that appears to be Martin Harris's, and so I'll give you a couple $1,000 for it. After he'd already given me 50, and that was fine because I didn't know. And so I thought, well, gosh, that's really quite fair. And so what turned out that he had done.
So you didn't question that Martin Harris was in there? You just thought
No. In fact, later, and during the investigation and in the preliminary hearing, I had been asked let me go back and say, so that, what Mark did, we found out later, was he wrote a little poem about returning this book that you borrowed, I don't remember the text of it, in Martin Harris's handwriting. Because here you have a known Harris family item and no examples of Martin Harris's handwriting extant. And so Mark created Martin Harris's handwriting, which was used to establish the authenticity of the Salamander Letter.
Oh, wow.
So I had unwittingly given him just what he needed to do that. And so later I was asked, both Wade that I mentioned earlier that worked with me were asked if we remembered this thing in the back of the book. And Wade thought for sure he remembered it, and I wasn't sure. And I said, well, it could have been, you know, and I think I even said at one point that, yeah, I kind of, everybody wanted me to remember that it was there, it seemed like. And so I think in my mind it was there. But it wasn't, but it was created by Mark, and that fit into his scheme. So the defense even tried to make him look good by saying, well, you know, that item that you'd sold for 50, he came back and offered you 2,000. Like, you know, yeah, that did happen. But so that was one of the things that was talked about during my testimony. Anyway, and there were a number of other people that were interviewed that day, but you can't stay and listen to those, so I had to read about them later.
So
they did a plea bargain.
Yes, that's where I was just going.
So it never did go to trial, and he agreed to plead guilty to certain charges, second-degree murder, and I think one other count, maybe they dropped a lot of it. And then
second-degree murder, you said.
Yeah, that's the way I remember it. And then he agreed to expand on how he had committed his crimes, especially the forgeries and interviews. So he agreed to do that. And then they dropped a possible death sentence. And so he did consent and to being interviewed, and was interviewed at length, but then eventually stopped doing it. So they did publish his confessions, the interviews, I should say.
Oh, who published
They
it?
call them the county, as I recall.
Oh, so this is a government document.
Yeah, and then the Tanners reprinted it. So you can see where he talks about how he did some of the things that he did, including, the worst crimes of all. But it's chillingly fascinating.
Wow. So have you ever spoken with him since?
People ask me that. Well, do you ever go visit him? No, I don't go visit him, and we don't exchange Christmas cards. I mean, there's no reason why I would want to see him or talk to him again. He just caused so much harm and I'm one of the least victims, but there are many victims. That's why Rick Turley chose that title, I think, for his book, because there were many victims. But no, I haven't had any contact with him since the courtroom, and even there I just sort of looked at him. We never said anything. So he was he's really in for life. I don't think they'll ever let him out. They had an early parole hearing, and he was so cold-blooded in his responses. I think they determined that he'll be there the rest of his life. And the judge said, I want you to be in there the rest of your natural life. He was moved from Point of the Mountain down to the Gunnison unit, I understand, a year or so ago.
Oh.
So he was in with one of the Lafferty brothers. They were cellmates for some time.
So I do have a neighbor who used to work at the prison, and I just talked to him just a week or two ago, and I asked him, did you ever see the Laffertys or Mark Hofmann? And he goes, oh yeah. And I think I said, well, what was he like or something? He said, well, one time I went to deliver Mark his dinner, and I said, dinner time or something like that, and he swore at me, and I was like, no dinner for you then. He goes, so Mark didn't eat that night.
Oh, wow. Well, Will Bagley characterized those two cellmates as the prophet and his scribe. Because Lafferty had all these revelations,
Right.
and then of course.
Yeah, we should do an interview on the Lafferty brothers. That's another awful case.
Terrible story.
One question I wanted to ask you, there are some critics of the church who, because, especially as you read Turley's book, he dealt with President Hinckley, Boyd K. Packer, Homer Durham, and quite a few general authorities, and duped them just as well as he duped everyone else. And some people say, well, if these are really prophets, seers, and revelators, shouldn't they have been able to identify this
Shouldn't
fraud?
they have the spirit of discernment?
Exactly. Do you think that's a fair charge?
Times.
Or how do you respond to that?
The way I respond is that we're all in good company because we all got fooled. His family got fooled, his own wife and his parents, his friends, his neighbors, other family, experts that tested his materials. He fooled everyone, including general authorities. So I guess I'm prone to grant them or give them a lot of slack because they're human just like we are. As Dallin Oaks said later, unless we're given a reason not to trust, we trust people. And nobody was imagining anything like what was really happening. And, I approach people on the basis of trust just like they did until you're given reason to no longer trust that person. So I don't think that they even would know to try to go beyond their normal human powers to try to discern something like that. They would have had no reason to be suspicious. I don't know how that works, but I think they were duped just like every other human that knew Mark. So I tend to be a lot more sympathetic because I felt just as stupid and taken and duped as anybody else, although I don't claim great powers of discernment. But I think that's a natural human reaction, is to believe someone that you have reason to trust. Mm-hmm. So I never did really understand why people would actually leave the church over that. I guess their expectations were much higher than mine. I don't expect human beings, even leaders, to have supernatural powers. That I don't know that they are granted any greater ability to discern that kind of thing than anybody else is. Maybe they do, but I just don't. I don't hold them guilty of anything other than, perhaps we were all a little too trusting, gullible. But in hindsight, we can see all that. But at the time, it just didn't seem like there was any cause to seriously question his honesty or integrity. And I feel for people who were very distraught over that aspect of, they were victims as well. But they had different expectations than I did of leaders. And I think a lot of it was because they didn't know their history very well and had lived too much in a black and white world. I tend to live in a world of gray more, and so I'm not as concerned, I guess, about things that don't seem to line up exactly. I think they merit investigation and serious study before you make serious decisions about the course of your life. Mm-hmm. So I feel bad for people who decided that they should leave because they felt that they were lied to not by Mark, but by the church, by the leaders, and it just didn't jibe with what they thought about their religion.
You mentioned that his wife, Kathy, or I don't know what his wife's name was.
Dory.
Dory.
Dora Lee is her real name.
She was
Dory.
duped as well.
Yes.
Do you maintain contact with her, number one? Number
once in
two,
a while.
Talk about her reaction.
She said at a symposium one time, she was silent for a long time about all of this, kind of kept to she was a private person. The way she put it was that for a period of years she was asleep. She really didn't know what was going on, didn't really try to know what was going on. She was just sort of in this state of sleep when it came to what her husband was doing. And had she not been in that state, she might not have lived. If she had been suspicious of what he was doing, in that locked office, or, if she had been more inquisitive, then who knows what might have happened. But there's no doubt in my mind that she was totally in the dark about his activities, that he had duped her just like he had everybody else. There's some that wonder how a spouse would simply not know those kinds of things, but he lived a double life, and he was able to keep his true nature from everybody. So I don't lay any blame at her door at all.
But you do still contact her?
No, once in a while, yeah. We had her come to a lunch. I don't know, maybe it's been almost a year ago, but every now and then we have contact, and we'll talk.
I'm
about
assuming
these
she's
things.
divorced. Is that a safe?
Yeah, they got divorced early on, and she has not remarried.
Okay. And I know he has at least one child, because I know I mentioned that she was in the hospital.
He has. I want to say 4, but I could be wrong. And one kind of touching story is that his son, Mike, when he came of age, wanted to go on a mission, and Matt Christensen, Steve's dad, had, I don't know if he did it publicly, but he embraced Bill Hoffman, Mark's dad, at one point, and said that he forgave Mark for what he had done. But even more, when Mark's son wanted to go on his mission, Mac completely outfitted him with clothing and I don't know what all to help him get started on his mission. I thought that was pretty generous of someone who had lost his son to the father.
Yeah, well, that's cool. I think Mac's a really good guy.
He is.
So, the one last question that I wanted to ask you, going back to the critics, we'll take the Joseph Smith III letter, patriarchal blessing that, was forged. And I know Mark was trying to play off the RLDS church and the LDS church, and the LDS church got it, and, I know that caused some bad feelings. But in several cases, I know that Mark went through the historical department to get things authenticated, but then sometimes he went around them and went straight to President Hinckley and Boyd K. Packer and some of the other general authorities. And I know that Elder Hinckley, he took some of those and just put them in the vault, and so the historical department didn't even know about some of these documents. And so some of the critics will say, well, take the Joseph Smith III. I mean, that's a potentially very important document. How do you react to the fact that critics may say, well, he's hiding that away. He's hiding unflattering history to keep it away from the public. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I hadn't heard Elder Packer had been involved, but.
Well, that's in Rick Turley's book.
Well, okay, I guess I had forgotten that.
Yeah, there was a meeting with
but I don't think he had anything to do with acquiring documents. But
no, well, I think Elder Hinckley was in the first presidency at the time, but I know that Packer was involved in these weekly or monthly meetings with Durham and a few other people. But it sounds like Hinckley was more of the...
Yeah, he was... Yeah, Mark apparently was able to have direct contact with President Hinckley on numerous occasions. And apparently he was the one who acquired at least some documents that kind of circumvented the normal acquisitions process, and they were of more sensitive nature. I don't have any inside knowledge or special information about that. I mean, it does come out in the books and so on, and that bothered people. I think when that came to light, from President Hinckley's perspective, if I were in his shoes, I would understand better the motivation, I think. I mean, like I said, everything's 2020 now in our vision, but I can understand why that would be a difficult thing for people, because it does give the impression of trying to hide things and put things in the best light possible. So I can certainly understand that perspective. I don't have enough knowledge myself about how those things happen. Most what I know is what I've read as well. And so I think in an ideal world, things would be acquired, things would be made known. I think today we have a much higher degree of transparency than we did then, and I think things would be handled differently today than they were then. But I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard, and look at what has come forward, and that's kind of in the light of day because of modern scholarship and a more open attitude toward making our history more accessible and better known. I mean, look at the Gospel Topics essays, for example, on the church website. I think there's a much higher degree of openness and a desire to not keep things in the shadows.
I guess under the Leonard Arrington era of church history, Leonard Arrington was the church historian in the 70s and was very much more open to, real scholarship. He's actually had a degree in history. I know Rick Turley has a degree in history and law as well. But it seems like there was some openness in the 70s, and then in the 80s, all of a sudden it got closed. You had in 1993, I think we had the September 6th, where President Packer spoke out against intellectualism and feminism, and the third thing that escaped my mind.
Was it might have been homosexuality?
Yeah, I think it was. And then, my question is, we had this openness, and then in the 80s it closed. Do you think a lot of the reason that the closed off history was due to Mark Hofmann and some of these controversial documents? And I know that recently, I have a book on Joseph Seer Stones published by Deseret Book, which, talks about the more magical nature of Joseph's translation, and I do remember, I believe it was at the Mormon History Association a few years ago, Ron Esplin, who's a church historian. This has probably been about 5 or 6 years ago, and at the time I remember when he said it, I was a little skeptical, but he said this is the most open time in church history. He says a lot of times we refer to the 1970s as the Camelot era. He says now is a Camelot era as well, and with the Joseph Smith papers and Joseph Seer Stones and some other things, I have to agree with Ron Esplin. I think this is really an unprecedented openness. Now, critics may say, well, that's because of the internet. But I also wonder how much did Mark Hofmann play in closing down the history that we've now opened up again? And even as we look at the Seer Stone, we talk about the Salamander Letter and the magic natures there. We kind of have opened up more history, and we're more open to, Joseph didn't really use the Urim and Thummim, we used the Seer Stone and that sort of thing. So what do you think are Mark's impacts on church history in general, especially in the 1980s?
He was asked during the interviews if he was trying to change church history. And at first he said no, and then he backtracked and said, well, I guess I was. And he did have an impact. He certainly made the church change its entire approach to security, and protecting its holdings, and it severely restricted access, I think. And there was a long period of time when they were trying to determine what they had in their own holdings that were genuine and weren't genuine. And he definitely had an impact on how things were done at the Church History Library. I know that it was a lot harder for me to do business with the church after that, in terms of, before things were more, I don't know what the right word is, but it was easier to do business. It was more informal, and it became very formal. There were processes you had to go through, and committees had to make decisions on acquisitions and things like that, rather than just being left to an individual.
Like President Hinckley?
Yeah, and then those who were under him that normally acquired things for the church. So yeah, it did make them re-examine everything, and I think it did have that effect of kind of closing things up out of fear and out of suspicion of what could happen. But there has been, like you said, a remarkable, I don't know, I guess you'd almost call it a renaissance in a way, and a much more openness. A lot of that is due to Elder Marlon Jensen, who was church historian in a 70 for a long time. He's emeritus now. And assistant church historian Richard Turley has had an enormous effect that way in terms of openness and real scholarship, and opening the books literally and figuratively. And Stephen Snow, who's the church historian now, and most of the people, at least that I know, in the church historical department are very committed to openness and to true scholarship, and to this process of knowing our history and making it available to everyone. I think it's quite remarkable compared to certain periods of our history. So I'm encouraged by it. I really think that we are, in a way, in a new era, and I can only hope that it will get even better. But the Joseph Smith Papers Project is one of the biggest evidences of that whole new attitude and openness. Those scholars are not given a list of restrictions as to what they can research and what they can write about and publish. It's talk about throwing the books open. They're doing it. They're making our history available and accessible, and there's some very impressive scholarship that's gone into that project, for example, and that's had spin-offs. We see a lot of other research and writing and publishing that's being done as a result of that, and that whole attitude. Rick is no longer assistant church historian. He's over public affairs now, but I think he's one of the unsung heroes, in my opinion. Has helped us get to the point where we are now, and those others that I've mentioned, and many that we can't take the time to name.
All right. Well, great. So we'll wrap this up. Do you have any last thoughts about anything we didn't cover as far as Mark Hofmann?
Well, let's see. Do we have another hour? There's a lot we haven't covered, but I think this will at least give people a flavor of what happened. It was a time it was hard to imagine, even while it was happening. It was just, there was a quality of surrealness and otherworldliness almost. Can this really be happening in our beautiful city and in our church? And we weren't prepared for those kinds of events. They were traumatic. They were very harmful to many people. The people who were killed by Mark and their families were the biggest victims, but there were so many victims that were affected in so many ways. I guess we just have to look to history to see how much harm a single individual can do, or how much good a single individual can do. But Mark chose a dark path, and it affected lots of lives. But I worried that after that, and I also had another thing happen. Another person close to me that betrayed my trust in a very dramatic way, and I wondered, would I ever trust anybody again? I even kidded people I was going to have my family investigated by the FBI to make sure that they were. But I worried that I wouldn't trust people in the future because my trust had been violated so dramatically, but it turned out that I just figured I can't live my life that way, and I can't be suspicious of everyone. That I will still trust people unless they give me a reason not to, and I found that it's a much better way to live my life, and it brings me a lot more peace than if I'm paranoid and suspicious and think the worst of people. So I try to think the best of them unless they give me a reason not to. But I think we've all learned a lot of lessons from these events, and I think we're better for having gone through the fire. I don't mean that it was a good thing for it to happen, but I think you have to choose how you're going to react to bad things that happen in your life, and I think most people were able to make those choices and go on with their lives and hopefully live better lives as a result.
Well, great. Well, Curt Bench, really want to thank you for letting me take your time here and benchmark books, and I'll encourage everybody to come into the bookstore. So, thanks again for participating with Gospel Tangents.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Curt Bench. If you miss him as much as I do, I think everybody misses Curt. It's just really sad that he's passed away and is no longer with us. Hey, everybody. On January 1st in the evening, we're going to get together, and I'm going to host the Gospel Tangents award show. It's the second annual award show for some of the best books that I read this year, and so I'd love to hear your nominations. Hopefully I haven't forgotten anything. So send them to gospeltangents@gmail.com if you have anything you want to share. And anyway, we'll be doing our awards show on the evening of January 1st. So come join us. Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.